What makes a person unforgettable? What invisible thread ties our thoughts to someone we barely know, while others vanish like a forgotten dream? These questions are not merely poetic, they cut to the core of human psychology. And if you seek influence, connection, or power, you must confront them. The answer is not love, not generosity, not kindness. It is desire. Raw, insatiable, carefully orchestrated desire. In a quiet neighborhood of Boston, Thomas was a man you wouldn't look at twice. Middle-aged, average height, salt and pepper beard, teacher by profession. But Thomas had learned something others hadn't. He understood people not through books or sentiment, but through careful observation. After years of being ignored, of being the friend-zoned confidant, he wanted to know why some people were magnetic, unforgettable, while he remained invisible. And so, in his solitude, he began to study, not just people, but patterns. He pored over writings by Carl Jung, Niccolo Machiavelli, even modern psychological studies on reward systems and emotional attachment. He learned that what hooks the human mind isn't constant approval. It's scarcity, it's uncertainty, it's the space between fulfillment and denial. The same principles that kept gamblers pulling levers, that made soldiers follow leaders into war, could apply to social life, to love, to influence. And that's where Thomas began his experiment, not to manipulate, but to understand and transform. We often believe that kindness is the key to winning hearts. And while kindness builds comfort, comfort does not inspire obsession. People don't become obsessed with the comfortable. They become obsessed with what they can't quite reach. Thomas learned that those who are freely available are quickly overlooked. The human brain is wired to devalue what is abundant. From a behavioral science standpoint, it's called hedonic adaptation, the diminishing value of repeated exposure to the same stimulus. Thomas changed his approach. He no longer answered every call. He didn't rush to please. He became selective, present but not persistent. He gave people glimpses of who he was, not the whole portrait. He let silence do the talking and distance stir the imagination. The effect was staggering. People began to seek his approval, wonder about his thoughts, yearn for his presence. They began to talk about him when he wasn't around. Something had shifted. This is not a tale of trickery. It is a psychological truth. People are enslaved by what they cannot possess. In our modern culture of instant gratification, anything that resists availability becomes a symbol of value. Thomas embodied that resistance. He turned presence into a privilege, conversation into a gift. He didn't chase admiration. He created a void, and people rushed to fill it with their fantasies, assumptions, and desires. If you want to be remembered, to be thought of when you are not in the room, you must do the same. Give strategically, not constantly. Appear, then withdraw. Let people feel the heat of your presence, then the chill of your absence. In doing so, you transform yourself from background noise to the haunting melody that plays long after the music stops. This is not cruelty, it is power. It is influence. It is, at its core, the architecture of desire. And it is only the beginning. Desire begins with absence, but it matures through scarcity. Once Thomas mastered the idea of being selectively present, he began to understand a deeper principle. Human attention is currency, and like any valuable commodity, the more it's in circulation, the less it's worth. So he made a decision. His time would no longer be given away freely. He thought back to his years in education, how students responded not to lectures that went on endlessly, but to pauses, to suspense. It was the silence before the answer that made them lean in. And the same was true in life. The most memorable people weren't the ones constantly talking, texting, and posting. They were the ones who appeared rarely, but left an impact each time they did. This insight wasn't born out of arrogance. It came from understanding a neurological truth. Our brains release dopamine not just in the experience of pleasure, but in the anticipation of it. Studies in behavioral neuroscience have shown that anticipation often triggers more intense emotional responses than the reward itself. Scarcity, then, doesn't reduce interest. It fuels it. When something is rare, our mind assumes it must be important. When someone is seldom seen, we imagine they must be valuable. Thomas began to engineer his presence like an artist crafts a sculpture, not by adding, but by subtracting. He declined invitations politely. He returned messages in his own time. At first, people pulled away, but then something curious happened. The very people who once overlooked him began to ask about him, to invite him again, to remember small details about him, hoping he'd reappear. In love and friendship alike, this scarcity principle applies. Think of the person you once couldn't stop thinking about. Chances are, they weren't always available. They didn't reply instantly. They didn't bare their soul at every chance. They remained just out of reach, and it was that very distance that stirred your longing. The mind fills in gaps with imagination, and imagination is far more addictive than reality. So Thomas began to measure his interactions. If a conversation felt rich, he ended it early, leaving the other person wanting more. If he attended a gathering, he left at the height of connection, not after it had dulled. His goal was simple: to become the person whose absence felt louder than others' presence. And as weeks passed, that's exactly who he became. This is the paradox of influence. To be valued, you must first become scarce. But it is not absence for the sake of absence. It is absence filled with purpose. Scarcity without intention breeds suspicion. Scarcity with poise breeds mystique. And mystique, when combined with presence, creates a gravitational pull that few can resist. Ask yourself, are you too available? Do you offer your time and energy without reserve? If so, do not be surprised when others take you for granted. But if you learn to step back with purpose, to let silence speak, to let time pass before returning, you will find yourself rising in the minds of others, not as a ghost, but as a figure they crave to understand. Scarcity is not about being distant. It's about being deliberate. And in that deliberateness, you create the echo that makes your presence unforgettable. As Thomas would later say, I stopped trying to be seen by everyone, and that's when they started looking for me. Mystery, Thomas discovered, was not a costume. It was a discipline. After mastering scarcity, he realized that the real power did not lie in being absent, but in what people imagined about him during that absence. Curiosity, he came to learn, was the fuel of obsession. And the most powerful way to awaken it was through controlled ambiguity. He began to notice how others rushed to explain themselves, to fill silence, to ensure they were understood. But Thomas chose a different path. He learned the value of saying less than he knew, of leaving parts of his story untold. When asked about his weekend, he would smile and offer a vague but intriguing answer. It was meaningful. When pressed further, he simply added, some things are better felt than explained. The human mind despises uncertainty. We are wired to resolve it, to fill the gaps. So when someone gives us an incomplete narrative, we invent the rest. We create a version of them that may be more compelling than the truth. And that imagined version is often the one we fall for. Thomas used this insight not to deceive, but to elevate the perception others had of him. He became a canvas on which others painted their fantasies. This wasn't manipulation. It was restraint. He gave enough truth to anchor belief, but never so much as to satisfy it. Conversations with him felt like puzzles with missing pieces. People leaned in, wondering what he meant. They replayed his words. They asked mutual friends about him. They tried to figure him out. And in trying, they couldn't stop thinking about him. Mystery has always been a potent force in human relationships. From religious symbols to political leaders to romantic interests, what is partially concealed often seems more powerful than what is fully revealed. Transparency may foster trust, but mystery fosters fascination. And in a world obsessed with oversharing, the person who withholds becomes rare and therefore valuable. Thomas didn't invent this strategy. He was simply applying what centuries of psychology and philosophy had already shown. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "It is not the lack of love, but the lack of friendship that makes unhappy marriages." And yet, even friendships benefit from mystery. When we know everything, the magic dissolves. But when there's always something more to uncover, relationships remain alive. So Thomas cultivated the art of being slightly unknowable. He would share stories that had no clear ending. He would reference books and experiences without fully elaborating. He let others wonder about the meaning behind his glances, the pauses in his sentences, the decisions he made. And in that wondering, he became unforgettable. Mystery is not about deception, it's about restraint. In every relationship, personal or professional, resist the urge to be fully known. Let people earn their way into your world. Let them discover you layer by layer, and always keep one layer hidden, for it is the hidden that becomes sacred. And so Thomas moved through the world quietly yet powerfully, not as someone trying to be understood by everyone, but as someone who made others work to understand him. He no longer shouted for attention. He whispered, and the world leaned in to listen. That is the true power of mystery, and it was only the third step in his transformation. Desire thrives on mystery, but it is dependency that cements obsession. Once Thomas mastered the subtle pull of ambiguity, he understood that to truly entrench himself in someone's mind, he had to become their emotional rhythm. Not through constancy, but through carefully measured unpredictability, what modern psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. The principle is simple but profound. When people receive rewards on a consistent schedule, they grow accustomed and begin to take them for granted. But when rewards are delivered irregularly, when affection, attention, and approval are given unpredictably, the human mind becomes addicted. It begins to crave the next high. This is the same mechanism that keeps gamblers hooked to slot machines and followers glued to social media likes. Thomas applied this principle with grace. When someone reached out, he didn't always reply immediately. Sometimes he responded with warmth and depth, other times with polite distance. There were days he'd share laughter over coffee and then disappear into solitude the next. This push and pull wasn't cruelty, it was emotional contrast. It made his approval unpredictable and therefore more powerful. He became the emotional weather others tried to forecast. A single compliment from him felt monumental because it wasn't guaranteed. A smile from him could lift spirits for days because it didn't come easily. Those who once overlooked him now hung on his words, hoping to catch the next breeze of affirmation. But Thomas wasn't playing games. His aim wasn't manipulation. It was mastery. He had learned through the writings of B.F. Skinner and the research on operant conditioning that behavior is most strongly influenced by inconsistent rewards. And unlike blind chance, he wielded this method with care, ensuring that every moment of attention he offered was genuine and therefore unforgettable. To deepen emotional dependency, he didn't just withhold affection, he magnified its impact. When he gave fully. His presence was intense. His words felt personal. He made people feel seen in a world that so often renders us invisible. And then he would withdraw, letting silence stretch, letting minds wander. Dependency is not built through force. It is built through contrast, through moments of emotional fullness followed by spaces of absence. It is in those spaces that people replay your words, wonder what changed, and crave the next connection. They begin to adjust their behavior to win your favor. They become participants in their own enslavement. In love, in leadership, in influence, this principle holds. If you are always available, you become predictable, and predictability kills passion. But if you learn to manage your presence like tides, sometimes sweeping in with warmth, other times pulling back into mystery, you create a longing that logic cannot dismiss. Thomas had become a master of emotional cadence. He was no longer just someone people liked. He was someone they needed to hear from, to be noticed by, to feel connected to. His unpredictability became his power. And through that power, he no longer chased approval. He summoned it. This is not manipulation. It is emotional craftsmanship. It is the conscious creation of contrast in a world that numbs us with sameness. When others never know where they stand with you, they keep standing closer, trying to understand. That is the architecture of dependency. And Thomas was only beginning to see how deep its roots could grow. Power without presence is illusion, but presence without strength is forgotten. Once Thomas had woven mystery and scarcity into his being, once he had learned to feed desire through unpredictability, he arrived at the next principle: strength. Not physical, not loud, but internal, quiet, unshakable, the kind of strength that lives in posture, in silence, in the refusal to chase. People do not obsess over weakness. They may pity it, they may support it, but they do not long for it. True obsession is rooted in the perception of superiority. When someone seems above us, not by title or status, but by presence. Thomas understood this deeply. He had watched too many people, including himself, try to earn love through submission, giving everything, asking for nothing. All it ever brought was neglect. So he began to build what psychologists call secure dominance, not dominance through force, but through self-possession. He stopped over-explaining. He no longer apologized for existing. He stood taller. He spoke slower. He looked people in the eye not to challenge them, but to show he could not be rattled. And when confronted with tension, he did not react. He responded or chose silence. Strength, he discovered, was not what you projected outward. It was what you refused to surrender inward. And the world responded. In meetings, his words carried more weight. In conversations, his pauses were respected. In relationships, his presence became grounding. People felt safer around him, yet also more intrigued, because power paired with restraint is irresistible. Thomas discovered a key principle of human interaction: how people perceive value in one another. He realized that when a person carries themselves with self-worth, others often see them in the same positive light. This comes from a place of genuine self-assurance, which has a way of inspiring others. True confidence remains steady, even during challenges, and inner strength provides a solid foundation. With this understanding, he started practicing self-discipline for his own personal growth. He began his days early and took care of his well-being to feel strong and capable. He spoke thoughtfully, knowing his words could build his presence. He learned to find validation within himself, understanding that healthy connections are built on self-sufficiency and mutual respect. This shift in his approach was subtle, but had a profound impact. People began deferring to him without knowing why. Friends sought his opinion more often. Acquaintances leaned in when he spoke. And in private relationships, he became the anchor, the one who didn't react to every emotion, but who remained steady through them. This steadiness was interpreted as wisdom, as strength. And with strength comes awe. Awe is not admiration. Admiration fades. Awe lingers. It creates the illusion of elevation. When someone senses that you are not easily shaken, that you can walk away at any time, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect, they begin to cling. Obsession is born not from what you offer, but from what you represent. So Thomas no longer tried to be liked. He chose instead to be respected. And in doing so, he became desired. Because when people sense that you do not need them, that your world spins with or without their approval, they become pulled into your orbit. Not out of pity, not even out of love, but out of reverence. This was not arrogance, it was gravity. And gravity doesn't ask you to come closer. It pulls you silently until you can't leave. That was the strength Thomas cultivated. And it was the pillar that held all other principles in place. With strength as his foundation, Thomas began to notice a shift, not just in how people treated him, but in how he saw the world. He had once believed influence came from doing more, giving more, proving more. But now he saw the truth. Power comes not from pursuit, but from stillness. It's the energy of the mountain, not the chase of the wind, that commands awe. One evening, a woman named Rachel, a longtime acquaintance, invited him for coffee. They had crossed paths over the years, exchanged polite greetings, nothing more. But now she was curious. "You've changed," she said. "You seem heavier, but in a good way, like there's something I can't quite figure out." Thomas smiled, offering no explanation. He had learned the value of letting others name the mystery for themselves. She leaned in, asked more questions, tried to uncover something, and though he answered, he never revealed too much. He allowed the unknown to do its work. The result? She left the conversation thinking about him, not because he had dazzled her with charm, but because he had given her a glimpse of something she couldn't quite touch. This is the next principle: emotional weight, the ability to leave a residue in someone's mind, not through intensity, but through meaning, through presence. It's the difference between a loud voice and a deep one. One startles, the other stays. Thomas began to refine his interactions. He no longer spoke to be heard, he spoke to be remembered. He chose words with depth, allowed silence to carry its own message. He practiced active listening, not as a technique, but as a philosophy. When others spoke, he didn't just wait to respond. He received. He reflected. He made them feel in those moments like they were the only person in the world. And therein lies the paradox. The more he made others feel seen, the more they longed to see him. The more he gave attention with intention, the more people sought his presence. Because emotional weight is not about dominating a space. It's about anchoring it, making others feel like they are on solid ground when you are near. He also learned to carry pain differently, not by hiding it, but by holding it with grace. People are drawn to those who have suffered and survived without bitterness. They become mirrors of resilience. And Thomas embodied this. He didn't speak of his past often, but when he did, he spoke with clarity, not complaint. His strength didn't come from having no wounds. It came from learning to walk with them. This emotional weight created a new kind of gravity. People began to confide in him, not because he asked, but because they felt safe. He had become a still point in a spinning world, and stillness, in an age of noise, is magnetic. Understand this. Obsession is not always created by drama, by romance, or by pursuit. Sometimes it is born from the quiet impact of someone who makes us feel both understood and uncertain. Someone who speaks little but says much. Someone whose presence calms, yet whose absence stings. This was Thomas now, not a storm, but the eye within it. And the deeper he stepped into this role, the more people became drawn, not to what he did, but to who he had become. A mirror. A mystery. A force. And all of it anchored by one truth. Emotional weight is the foundation of unforgettable influence. Once Thomas had cultivated strength and emotional weight, he began to understand another vital truth. True power is not in how much attention you receive, but in how much control you exert over your own. In a world desperate for approval, the one who is selective with their focus becomes king. Thomas no longer offered his attention freely. He had learned that attention, when constantly given, loses all value. But when it is rare, it becomes a reward. And when people experience your attention as a reward, they begin to seek it, crave it, shape themselves to earn it. He had become the prize, not because he asked to be, but because he withheld what others gave away too easily. He started applying this principle everywhere, in work meetings, social settings, even online. He would observe more than he spoke. When he did speak, he'd make it count. His compliments were few, but sincere. His criticisms were calm, never impulsive. He showed interest not out of politeness, but out of genuine curiosity. And that authenticity made his attention feel like a spotlight. This restraint created asymmetry, something every student of influence must understand. Human relationships are rarely balanced. One person usually holds more emotional power, and that power often belongs to the one who appears less invested. The less you need someone, the more they need you. The less you seek validation, the more others seek it from you. Thomas embraced this imbalance not to manipulate, but to lead. He realized that people crave leadership in subtle ways. They want to be guided emotionally, not dominated. So he offered guidance through example. When others panicked, he remained still. When others gossiped, he remained silent. When others sought drama, he offered clarity. And soon his silence spoke louder than their noise. This made his time sacred. Invitations from him became meaningful. Approval from him became a milestone. Disapproval, a rare event, carried weight. The very scarcity of his attention increased its value tenfold. And people adjusted accordingly. They listened more closely. They followed his lead, not out of fear, but out of admiration. Thomas became, in essence, a curator of his own presence. He learned to say no, to walk away, to let go of relationships that drained his energy, not because he was callous, but because he knew his attention was finite. By choosing where to invest it, he increased its power. This is what many never understand. The more you chase people, the more they run. The more you offer yourself without boundary, the more you become invisible. But if you conserve your presence, if you make it a conscious offering, not a given, you become irreplaceable. Thomas's life grew quieter, but also richer. He didn't need crowds. He didn't need approval. He needed alignment with his own values, his own rhythm. And in that alignment, he became magnetic. People didn't just want his attention. They wanted to be worthy of it. So ask yourself, is your attention too cheap? Do you give it away to those who haven't earned it? If so, you dilute your power. But if you reserve it, if you treat it like the rare resource it truly is, you will begin to notice a shift. Others will lean in, they will adjust, and they will remember you not for what you demanded, but for what you refused to give away without purpose. With the foundation of scarcity, mystery, emotional strength, and selective presence laid, Thomas stepped into the next phase of influence, unpredictability. He had observed something crucial. People do not become obsessed with routine. They become obsessed with uncertainty, with the tension of not knowing what comes next. This wasn't about being erratic. It was about crafting surprise within boundaries. Thomas began to experiment with rhythm. One day he'd offer a deep and vulnerable conversation that left someone feeling seen. The next he'd pull back, offering little more than a nod or a thoughtful glance. This contrast stirred something in others. It kept their minds turning, wondering what had changed, what he was thinking, what they might do to draw him close again. He was no longer just a presence. He was an experience, one that couldn't be predicted, and that made him unforgettable. Studies in behavioral psychology show that the human brain becomes most engaged when facing uncertainty. The same reason people check their phones compulsively is the same reason we fall for someone unpredictable. The brain craves resolution, and in its absence, it obsesses. Thomas was careful, though. He never played with emotions cruelly. His unpredictability had structure. He would give sincerely, then step back, not to punish, but to allow space for desire to grow. He didn't disappear to cause fear. He disappeared to create contrast. The key was timing, always leaving when the connection was strong, never when it was fading, always ending an encounter on a note that left others wanting more. And this principle extended beyond romance. In his professional life, he'd surprise colleagues with sudden insights during meetings where he had remained quiet. At community events, he'd shift from warm storyteller to reflective listener. This unpredictability made him the subject of whispered fascination. People began to describe him with words like enigmatic, deep, and compelling. He learned that mystery wasn't just about withholding information. It was about creating emotional movement, keeping others off balance, not through chaos, but through contrast. A person who always agrees becomes predictable. A person who challenges you, supports you, then withdraws for reflection becomes unforgettable. And Thomas had become just that. This kind of energy shifts relational dynamics. Others lean forward while you remain centered. They reach out while you choose when to return. They analyze their words and actions, trying to decode your responses. And every time they fail to predict you, their fascination deepens. Thomas had effectively become the mental puzzle people couldn't solve. He wasn't cold, he wasn't aloof, he was simply unreadable, deliberately so. And this unreadability didn't isolate him. It elevated him. People began to seek his company not because he made them feel secure, but because he made them feel alive. Here's the truth. Predictability is the death of magnetism. To remain unforgettable, you must master the art of rhythm. Show up, pull back, offer light, then shadow. Not randomly, but intentionally. Let others ride the wave of your presence. And when you disappear, let their longing do the work. Thomas wasn't chasing obsession. He was creating it through uncertainty, contrast, and intentional unpredictability. And by now, he was no longer just someone people liked. He was someone they couldn't stop thinking about. By now, Thomas had evolved into something rare, a man whose absence could speak louder than most people's presence. But there was still one essential element to master, one that would root obsession not just in attraction, but in reverence. It was time to become a mirror. The most unforgettable people are not those who simply impress us. They are those who reflect something we long to see in ourselves. Thomas understood that if you want someone to be drawn to you deeply and unconsciously, You must become the projection surface of their unspoken desires, dreams, and doubts. The goal is not to change who you are, but to become deeply attuned to who they are and reflect that essence back to them. He began to listen more intently, not just for content, but for emotional undercurrents. When people spoke about their frustrations, he didn't offer advice. He offered understanding. When they shared their hopes, he didn't tell his own stories. He asked better questions. The more people opened up to him, the more they began to associate his presence with self-discovery. And that association created emotional fusion. Cognitive psychology calls this transference, the unconscious redirection of feelings from one person onto another. It often occurs in therapy, but it happens in everyday relationships too. When someone feels fully seen, heard, and subtly mirrored, they begin to assign you significance beyond logic. They feel bonded to you without always understanding why. Thomas didn't manipulate this. He respected it. He used it to build trust, to deepen connection, but always kept a quiet part of himself reserved. He gave people space to find themselves in his presence, but he never made himself the center of their world. That distinction between mirroring and overshadowing is critical. He also mirrored through subtle mimicry, not imitation, but alignment, matching energy levels, pausing when the other paused, smiling not to charm, but to validate. This created an emotional resonance that made others feel at ease, even enchanted. They walked away from conversations with him feeling more themselves, not less. But here's the paradox. The more you help people feel like their best selves in your presence, the more they want to be near you. And the more they want to be near you, the deeper the emotional imprint you leave. It is not your story that makes them obsessed. It is their story told through your presence that binds them. Thomas had become a mirror with weight, not empty, not passive, but reflective in the truest sense. He didn't inflate people's egos. He reflected their truths. He offered a quiet sanctuary where masks could fall. And once someone experiences that level of authenticity, they chase it, not because of flattery, but because of need. This was the invisible thread he wove through every relationship, the promise of self-recognition. In his presence, people glimpsed who they wanted to become, and that glimpse stayed with them, haunting their thoughts, drawing them back. So remember this, to make someone obsessed, do not try to impress them. Make them feel seen. Do not make yourself the center of attention. Make them the center of their own revelation. When you become the mirror they cannot find anywhere else, they will return to you again and again, sometimes without even knowing why. Thomas had become a master of psychological presence. He no longer needed to assert influence directly. It radiated from him quietly, like heat from a stone that had spent all day in the sun. Yet for all his restraint, subtlety, and strength, there was one final lever he needed to pull, one that would convert fascination into dependence, interest into fixation. It was the calculated use of vulnerability, not the performative kind that floods social media timelines, not the self-serving confessions that demand attention, but true earned vulnerability, the kind that peels back one layer, and only one, when the time is right. That's the secret. Vulnerability must feel like a privilege, not a strategy. Thomas knew this instinctively. After months of crafting emotional scarcity, he understood that revealing something personal too soon would weaken the structure he had built. But shared at the right moment, vulnerability becomes a sacred thread. It creates the illusion of intimacy not because it's false, but because it's rare. And rarity, as always, multiplies value. He would share a quiet detail from his childhood. Never dramatic, never exaggerated, only when someone had shown him emotional integrity first. He might admit to a regret, but never with self-pity. Just enough to remind people that strength isn't the absence of struggle. It's the integration of it. And every time he did, the effect was palpable. Walls lowered, eyes softened, people leaned closer. There's a term in clinical psychology, mutual vulnerability. It's the force that deepens bonds between therapist and client, between partners, between comrades in battle. It's what turns connection into loyalty. When someone who appears strong reveals even a crack in the armor, it doesn't diminish them. It humanizes them. It makes them real. And reality paired with mystery is intoxicating. Thomas never cried in front of others. He didn't need to. But once, during a late-night walk with a close friend, he spoke about a decision he regretted deeply, how he once stayed silent when someone needed him to speak. He didn't dramatize it. He simply said, "I've learned that silence isn't always kindness." And then he fell silent again. The moment lingered. His friend said nothing for a while. Then, without warning, they opened up about something they had never told anyone. That was the moment Thomas realized. The right kind of vulnerability doesn't just deepen your power, it multiplies it. Because it invites others to step into their own truth, guided by your example. But vulnerability must never be weaponized. It must never be overused. If you bleed on every page, people will stop reading. But if you offer a single, carefully chosen page from a closed book, people will crave the rest of the story. Thomas learned to use his stories sparingly and his silences generously. He spoke less to impress and more to reveal, only when revelation was earned. And that made each shared truth sacred. To those around him, he had become both fortress and invitation. Someone who felt safe yet thrilling, known yet unknowable. And that blend, the controlled fire of power wrapped in moments of sincere humanity, was what transformed admiration into obsession. This is the paradox of influence. People want to believe you are strong, but they fall in love with the parts of you that bleed. And when they sense that those moments are rare, shared only with them, they will protect those memories like treasure. They will return to you again and again, not just for who you are, but for who they believe they have been allowed to see. By now, Thomas had become a figure of quiet authority and irresistible presence. But he understood something few others did. Obsession, once kindled, is not self-sustaining. Like a flame, it must be tended, fed not just by mystery and scarcity, but by rhythm, the precise alternation between emotional warmth and cool withdrawal. This was not cruelty, it was design. Thomas had learned from nature itself. The tides do not stay in, nor do they remain out. They return and recede, and in that rhythm, the shoreline is shaped. So it is with human attachment. If you are always near, you become noise. If you are always absent, you become forgotten. But if you appear, offer meaning, and then retreat, you become unforgettable. He developed a rhythm of presence, not a schedule, but a flow. He'd send a note, brief, thoughtful, then vanish for days. He'd share an insight in a conversation, then offer no follow-up. He would show up to events only occasionally, always leaving early, always after delivering value. This created anticipation. It made people wonder, when will he return? What will he say next? Behavioral scientists call this intermittent reinforcement, and it is one of the most powerful behavioral motivators. Casinos use it, social media platforms use it, and Thomas used it, but ethically, intentionally. He was not manipulating emotions. He was respecting them. He understood that consistent, predictable attention dulls impact. Uncertainty, when delivered with care, keeps the mind engaged. He also varied the emotional tone of his presence. He could be warm, laughing easily, offering praise, but he could also be cool, silent, reflective. This polarity gave him depth. People couldn't pin him down. Was he opening up? Was he pulling back? That uncertainty kept them alert, emotionally invested. It wasn't confusion, it was complexity. And the mind does not release what it cannot resolve. Thomas watched as people adjusted to his rhythm. They became more thoughtful in their messages to him, more purposeful in their invitations. They spoke of him more when he wasn't there than when he was. And that was the point. Presence is a tool, but absence is the amplifier. When you leave at the right moment, your echo becomes louder than your voice. He was now, for many, the unresolved story, the emotional question that lingered. And this is a powerful place to inhabit, not to harm, but to inspire. Because when others orbit around your rhythm, when they begin to time their emotional expectations to your movements, they are no longer acting from autonomy. They are reacting to you. But Thomas also understood the responsibility of this rhythm. He never withdrew out of spite. He never appeared just to tease. His rhythm was built on respect for himself and others. He gave when he had something true to offer. He disappeared when it was time to recalibrate. His life became a dance of approach and retreat, connection and solitude. And that dance made him impossible to ignore. because he had mastered not just the art of attraction, but the science of emotional pacing. And those who encountered him, even briefly, felt it. He didn't just occupy space. He shaped it. And in shaping space, he shaped memory. If you want to be unforgettable, study your rhythm, make your presence meaningful, make your absence echo. For it is not how often you are seen that determines your power. It is the emotional signature you leave behind when you go. With each passing month, Thomas noticed something remarkable. He no longer had to seek attention, connection, or influence. It came to him naturally. Why? Because he had become a symbol, not just a person. And symbols are not forgotten. They're remembered, studied, and internalized. But there was one final transformation left, one that would seal his presence in the minds of others, not just as someone intriguing, but as someone aspirational. It was the crafting of an identity so aligned, so coherent, so rooted in values and self-awareness that it could not be ignored. It was the creation of a personal mythos. Every legendary figure in history, whether a spiritual leader, philosopher, or a cultural icon, has lived a life not just of action, but of narrative. Their words and behaviors became stories. Their presence became metaphor. Thomas began to understand that if he wanted to remain unforgettable, he had to live a life that told a story larger than himself. He became deliberate about how he moved through the world, not performative, not artificial, but consistent. If he valued integrity, he honored it, even when no one was watching. If he spoke of self-discipline, he lived it, not occasionally, but daily. This alignment between words and deeds created trust. And trust, when paired with mystery, creates reverence. He also learned to share philosophies rather than opinions. People don't remember your take on last week's news. They remember the ideas that challenge them to see themselves differently. So Thomas spoke not about himself, but about life, about human nature, about truth and beauty and struggle. And in doing so, people began to associate his voice with wisdom, not just personality. The more consistent he became, the more magnetic his presence grew. He wore the same kinds of clothes, simple, elegant, unbranded. He had routines others admired. He quoted thinkers like Carl Jung, Baruch Spinoza, and Marcus Aurelius not to sound intelligent, but because they had become part of him. His life was no longer just his own. It was a signal to others. This is what it looks like to live deliberately. And herein lies a profound truth. The most influential people don't just live. They represent something. They embody a code, a philosophy, a path. When people look at them, they don't just see a person, they see possibility. And what people see as possibility, they chase, they admire, they remember. Thomas had become this for many. To some, he was a symbol of restraint in a world of excess. To others, he was a reminder that strength can be quiet. To a few, he was the first person who made them question the pace of their own lives. He didn't preach, he lived, and his life became his message. If you want to inspire obsession, not the shallow kind rooted in attraction, but the deep kind rooted in meaning, you must cultivate identity, not branding, identity, a set of values, behaviors, and habits that remain steady across time and context. You must live in such a way that others feel unstable in your presence, not because you provoke them, but because you make them reflect. Thomas had become not just a man others wanted to be around. He had become a mirror of who they wanted to become. And that is the highest form of influence. To be remembered not for what you gave, but for what you awakened. By now, Thomas no longer feared being forgotten. He had transcended that fear. Because when your life tells a story, people keep turning the pages, even after you have walked away. As Thomas continued to evolve, he recognized that mastery over others begins with mastery over self. This was not a revelation born of ego, but of discipline. He had witnessed many people rise through charm only to fall by inconsistency. Influence built on performance eventually crumbles, but influence rooted in character endures. The next transformation, then, was internal. It was time to refine his inner world, to shape not only how he was perceived, but how he thought, responded, and endured. He began to study the Stoics, reading Marcus Aurelius and Seneca not as philosophy, but as instruction. He practiced detachment, not from people, but from outcomes. This allowed him to stay grounded when others sought to provoke or praise. Compliments didn't inflate him. Criticism didn't shake him. He had become, in the words of Nietzsche, a man who is not disturbed by the world, but who disturbs the world by being unmoved. Thomas made self-control a ritual. When emotions rose, he did not suppress them, he examined them. Why did he feel envy? What triggered his anger? What desire was hiding beneath disappointment? This constant self-inquiry created a man who was rarely reactive and deeply reflective. And that kind of emotional steadiness became a rare commodity in a world of noise. Others noticed. When friends experienced conflict, they came to him for counsel. When decisions had to be made under pressure, people turned to Thomas, not because he had all the answers, but because he wasn't afraid of stillness. In tense meetings or family disputes, he didn't fill silence with words. He let it stretch. And in that stillness, people began to reveal themselves. This is what modern psychology refers to as emotional regulation, the ability to manage your internal state without spilling it into others. And those who master it project what researchers call affective presence, a calm that influences the emotional state of those around them. Thomas had become the emotional thermostat in every room, not because he imposed order, but because he radiated clarity. He also learned to embrace solitude, not as loneliness, but as training. It was in solitude that he sharpened his thoughts, observed his patterns, and designed his days. He didn't fear being alone because his mind had become a trusted companion. And in that self-possession, others found a kind of gravity they couldn't explain. People began to ask him how he did it, how he stayed so composed, how he seemed to glide rather than react. But Thomas never gave them a formula. He only offered questions. What are you avoiding by rushing? What are you seeking in approval? What would you become if you stopped needing more? In truth, Thomas had stopped seeking to influence others. He had turned inward, and it was that inward strength that made his influence grow. He no longer needed to be admired. He needed to be aligned. And in that alignment, others saw what they were missing. This is the paradox. The less you need from others, the more they give. The more you master your internal chaos, the more others trust your calm. The more you live by inner law, the more you become a symbol of outer power. Thomas had become untouchable, not because he withdrew from the world, but because he carried within him a world that could not be disturbed. And those around him, knowingly or not, began to orbit closer, hoping to find that same unshakable center in themselves. With each principle internalized and embodied, Thomas had become more than just a man others admired. He had become the axis around which people's emotional worlds began to turn. But there was one final element needed to lock this transformation into something enduring. Legacy. Not in the grand historical sense, but in the deeply personal sense of how you are remembered in the minds and hearts of others. Thomas came to understand that to be truly unforgettable, one must leave behind emotional fingerprints. These aren't tied to grand gestures or dramatic events. They are small, consistent moments of impact, quiet insights, a timely word, a gesture of grace that continue to live in others long after you've gone. He began to shift his focus from influence to imprint. Rather than trying to impress, he sought to elevate. When he spoke with someone, his goal wasn't to be remembered for what he said, but for what they discovered about themselves through the conversation. His presence became a catalyst, not a spotlight. He left notes, short, handwritten messages that carried a sentence or two of truth. He gave books, not to show his intellect, but to plant seeds in the minds of those ready to read them. He asked unusual questions that lingered. What would your life look like if you stopped living for approval? Or what truth are you pretending not to know? These weren't tactics. They were gifts. He offered clarity without demanding gratitude. And that was the final twist in the psychology of obsession. When people feel changed by you, they rarely forget you. Neuroscience supports this. The human brain attaches significance to people and events that cause deep emotional or cognitive shifts. We don't remember facts, we remember feelings. And Thomas had mastered the art of creating meaningful emotion. Legacy also came through consistency. He didn't change personas depending on his audience. Whether he was speaking to a neighbor, a colleague, or a stranger at a cafe, His energy was the same: steady, curious, respectful. This congruence reinforced the emotional blueprint he left behind. People may not have understood all of him, but they trusted the feeling they had around him. And trust, paired with mystery, becomes reverence. Perhaps most important, Thomas never sought to be remembered. He sought to be useful. He didn't chase the role of mentor or guide, but he embodied it in how he lived. And in doing so, people began to tell stories about him, to each other, to themselves. They quoted him, they shared his questions, they even mimicked his quiet habits. He had become a myth, not larger than life, but deeper than it. This is how legacy begins. Not in your name being written on buildings or screens, but in your character being written into someone else's decisions. When your influence becomes invisible, yet undeniable. When someone hears your voice in a moment of doubt or copies your calm in a moment of crisis, that is legacy. Thomas understood now. Obsession is not the goal. Presence is. And presence, when practiced with integrity, depth, and intentional withdrawal, becomes legacy. You don't have to chase it. You simply have to live it. He had walked a long path through scarcity, mystery, rhythm, strength, and now into legacy. And he had done so not to control others, but to master himself. And in that mastery, others found something they couldn't look away from: a mirror, a guide, a force that lingered. He wasn't trying to be unforgettable. He just was. Thomas's journey had not been one of ego or performance. It had been a quiet, deliberate transformation. From invisible to unforgettable, from eager to composed, from chasing to commanding. And now, as he stood in the fullness of who he had become, one final truth emerged. Obsession is not about being needed, it is about being chosen. The final stage of influence is not when people crave you out of desperation. It is when they choose you freely, again and again, even in your absence. That kind of devotion is not forged in drama or manipulation. It is cultivated through mastery of presence, meaning, and restraint. It is not loud, it is earned. Thomas no longer needed to pull people close. They came willingly. Not because he dazzled them, but because he changed them. His strength wasn't in how much he said or did, but in what others discovered about themselves when he was near. He had become a quiet architect of transformation, shaping the internal landscapes of those around him. The beauty of this final stage was that he no longer cared about the attention. His life wasn't built on external validation. It was built on internal alignment. He had become someone who lived his values, spoke with intention, withheld strategically, revealed selectively, and remained unshaken in the face of both praise and provocation. He understood now, obsession, real obsession, is not about being pursued. It's about becoming unforgettable through the depth of your character, the clarity of your boundaries, and the mystery of your inner world. You do not demand loyalty. You inspire it. You do not force connection. You allow it to grow or wither as it should. And because of this, what remains is pure. Devotion without chains. Love without neediness. Respect without performance. Thomas's story ends not with a grand moment, but with a simple truth. He walks through his life with presence. He speaks when necessary. He listens more. He smiles rarely, but when he does, it lands like thunder. People remember him not because he made himself the center, but because he made others feel something they could not explain. That is the final art of making anyone obsessed with you, not through power games or emotional tricks, but through the rare force of quiet self-mastery. You don't shout to be heard. You whisper so they lean in. You don't give everything. You give meaning. You don't chase attention. You cultivate presence. And that, in the end, is how you become unforgettable. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. What presence are you leaving behind in the minds of others? What rhythm? What silence? What strength are you known for? And most of all, who are you when no one is watching? If you found value in this journey, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel for more transformative narratives, and sharing your reflections in the comments below. Your story matters. And perhaps, like Thomas, it's time you began to shape it with intention.